started with the vulnerabilities. Firstly, what is a vulnerability? Well, it can be defined as software flaws or configuration errors that allow attackers to violate the security objectives, the confidentiality, integrity, and the availability of the system. And typically, the attackers can exploit vulnerabilities to cause damage onto our systems. Okay? And those vulnerabilities can arise from bugs in applications or design flaws in the systems. For example, miscoding using a C language can cause a buffer overflow vulnerability that people can exploit. And if we think about WEP, the web wireless encryption standard, it has a design flaw where the initial vectors are not encrypted, so people can break the encryption by exploiting the design flaws of the protocol. Okay. And those type of vulnerabilities can be found in various layers of the system, starting from the applications down to the networks and even at hardwares. So for us to remove and patch those vulnerabilities, we need to be able to identify and find them. Okay? And one of the approach is to use vulnerability scanning. Of course, we can try to test such as penetration testing to discover and find those vulnerabilities. But trial and error type of style may not be consistent and systematic for different types of systems. Vulnerability scanning essentially is to identify those flaws in a systematic way. And it also finds the details about where those vulnerabilities are located, such as different services that are running which has those vulnerabilities. And it can also provide services where it can check that those vulnerabilities, if patched or removed, that they are done correctly. Okay, so this is one of the first steps towards securing our systems as a part of preemptive steps before the attackers can exploit. So the term scanning literally means the collection of information, but in particular in our computer systems and the entities they belong to. Okay? That's from a defense point of view, but the attackers will also do some sort of a scanning as part of the attack. So in the pre-attack phase, essentially this is the beginning part. They will try to collect informations about the systems and find those vulnerabilities which they can use to exploit. And this is commonly known as the reconnaissance step, where they just collect data and try to figure out what will be the best attack scenario to efficiently get into the system to do what they like to do. So how are those vulnerabilities discovered? Well, there are various tools available which can be used. We'll have a look at some of them shortly. But typically those tools will identify the known vulnerabilities. Okay? So those vulnerabilities are already exposed. So if you remember in week 4 when we did the attack classifications, we talked about some zero-day vulnerabilities, zero-day attacks. And such attacks, which are not known, cannot be detected using such tools. Okay? And essentially those tools are trying to figure out the known vulnerabilities by looking at the exploit steps to exploit them and see if those vulnerabilities are triggered. And the new vulnerabilities, for instance, those zero-day vulnerabilities, will be identified manually by humans. Okay. And there are various groups that are working towards identifying those vulnerabilities, like various hacker groups, black hats or white hats. There are security companies that are always on the watch for new softwares that gets released and trying to figure out ways to exploit them. And also various researchers trying to come up with new defense technologies and also ways to exploit commonly used systems. Okay. So for example, a group may discover a vulnerability related to a software, and this can be by accident or through a directed research. So they wanted to find this, or they could find this bug by accident. So one of the first worms that was released, that vulnerability was found by accident, kind of. He wasn't really looking for it. He was trying to search ways to spread a lot of packets into the network, and that's how he accidentally discovered that. And those vulnerabilities then can be disclosed to the public, and once it's disclosed, those signatures or the ways that those can be exploited can be now included with the part of the tools. Okay. So here's a bit of a overview of what type of vulnerabilities that were discovered in the past. So if you look closely, pre about 2006, you have quite a lot of unclassified number of vulnerabilities. Okay, and since then a lot of efforts have been put into to classify them as closely as possible, and we have a lot of variants. But you can see as the time passes, in 2018 the other type of vulnerabilities are growing again. So this also highlights that the attack pattern is changing through the time, and you can easily think that the defense mechanisms that are protecting our systems nowadays are making an existing attack more difficult, and therefore the attackers have to find other ways of trying to exploit our systems. Okay, and as the time passes, that those vulnerabilities that were classified as others will then again be classified, maybe something into a new one, and this might repeat over time. So not just dealing with the current problems, but we also need some sort of a mechanism that can adapt to changes over a period of time. Okay, so let's have a look at more on the vulnerability scanning. There are some widely used scanning categories, including port scanners, network vulnerability scanners, and web application vulnerability scanners. So the port scanners just trying to probe different ports to see if any of them are open, which should be closed. So example, a tool is to use the Nmap, and Nmap actually can be used as part of the attacks to discover an open port. But do notice that if you try to probe using Nmap on a public domain, those public domains will have a good chance that they will be monitoring these type of scanners, and so you might be either blacklisted or they might trace you back and get you in some trouble. So try not to use these type of tools on a public network. It will be good to test them locally to understand what those scanners do, but yes, keep it within the boundaries of your own network for these tools. So that's the port scanners, and if we go a little bit more broad onto the networks, There are tools like Nessus or OpenVAS, and those are network vulnerability scanners. So they will scan through the network, including all the IPs. So they will identify the host. They will check up what kind of OS it's running, and if possible, they could also check some applications that are running. And they have a list of vulnerability database, which will match to the scanned information and notify the user of such vulnerabilities. Okay. Of course, there are some other tools like Qualys or Saint, but Nessus and OpenVAS, those are used quite widely. Nessus has become a commercial tool, but OpenVAS, I believe, is still part of a freeware license. Okay. And if you're more focused on the web applications or the high-level items, things like the OWASP provides a good list of vulnerability scanning tools for these. So we have learned throughout that there are different types of attacks that are applicable into our systems. So those vulnerability scanning tools will try to look at different categories and discover those. And of course, network and applications are not the only categories that can be looked at. So we should also consider database security scanners, host-based vulnerability scanners, etc. So there are many different tools available nowadays. It's a matter of understanding what kind of security posture that our network has. For this particular one, we'll look at the first couple of the network-based vulnerability scanners. So let's start with the basics of scanning. Okay. So the very first thing we could do is, well, look at the pings and ICMP. Okay. So this is very initial step of discovering that such server or the host exists in the network. Right? So we can just send out some ping requests, ICMP requests to check whether they will give you a reply. Okay? And as we know, the ping or ICMP can be used towards formulating different type of attacks, such as denial of service. But nowadays, ping is not much of a threat, but this still gets used as part of the reconnaissance step towards identifying the service that they want to target. Okay. The next thing we can go for is TCP and UDP scans. So this is where the port scanning comes in. So for example, we can ping our university web. Okay, so it will tell you exactly where the ping is directed. So it's not directly pinged to the uwa.edu.au, but rather a bit longer. So that's where the UWA website is hosted on, and it also provides you the IP address of where that is. Okay, so there are a few things that we can identify with the ping itself. So number one is the packet length. Okay, and this packet length has been previously been manually set to cause a denial of service attacks. Nowadays, it's much less effective due to our network performance and computer performance, and pings are very tiny. Number two is the echo packet length, and etc. Okay, so these are some details, but we can identify some of those items which can be used as part of the attack. So port scanning is like trying to probe into the host computers or the servers to see if there are any open gates that we can get into. Okay, and of course there are some designated ports for typical services. For example, the HTTP is sitting on port 80, HTTPS sitting at 442, etc. Okay, and these ports will map to a specific applications. So if you know that there are applications that are vulnerable, that has a vulnerability, then these ports can be exploited. But at the same time, we can scan for those ports to see what's open, and say if port 80 is open, then we know that belongs to an HTTP application. Okay, so then we can start preparing our exploit based on the information that we get from a port scanning. So port scanning is used quite widely to discover what kind of applications there are, what kind of services that are running, and then we can form our attack to exploit those services and applications. And here are some of the well-known ports. So as we've seen, the HTTP sitting on at port 80 is quite a default. We also have secure shell sitting on port 22, telnet on port 23, the DNS server is sitting on at port 53, etc. Okay. So if we can discover that such ports are open, for example, port 53 is open, maybe we can try to poison the DNS server, okay, etc. Let's have a look at some other type of scanning. Okay. For instance, the TCP/UDP scanning. What the UDP scanning does is to send a UDP packet, and by the design default, no response means the port is open. Okay, and if you receive a reply saying this ICMP packet is unreachable, then the port is closed. So essentially, if it is open, it will receive those packets and try to process it. Hence, there's no response. But if the port is closed, then it will send back that saying that this is closed port. Why are you sending this packet here? Okay. So the UDP scanning can be quite easily done. And here you can see there are some UDP protocols being used for different ports. The DNS is, for example, 1, DHCP, TFTP, okay, and also the SNMP. The TCP scanning is slightly different, and this is one way of doing it, but other ways of TCP scanning can be done. So let's have a look at this first. So the attacker will send synchronized packets, and if we know the TCP three-way handshake, then we know that we're going to receive back the synchronization and acknowledgement packet back, and this will indicate that the port is open. Okay, but if the TCP port replies with the reset packet, then we know that this is closed. Okay. So we can initiate the three-way handshake to check whether the port is open or not. Okay, but we all know this, and from a defender's point of view, we don't want anybody that we don't know about trying to initiate the three-way handshake. Okay? You're not going to walk down the street and try to handshake everybody that you don't know. We will only handshake the people we're supposed to handshake. Okay? So although from the attacker's point of view this is fast and requires no privilege to do so, from a defender's point of view, we will restrict this as much as possible. So there are various scanning tools, detection tools that are used to monitor the TCP ports, whether some unsuspected packets come in trying to initiate the handshake. Okay? So those once detected can be blocked to ensure that it's not just a probing type of packets trying to see whether the port is open or not. Okay? So to bypass this, we need to create our TCP scanning a bit more stealth. Okay? And one of the technique is called half-open scanning, or the TCP SYN scanning. So it's slightly different to just sending the SYN packet. We need to do a little bit further than that. Okay, so if the port is open, we can send a SYN packet, which you will receive SYN acknowledge packet back, but you will send back the reset packet straight away. Okay, so this is trying to say that you have sent a SYN egg packet to a place where it's closed. Okay, and if we do this, then many systems will not log this connection attempt. But if you just leave it as a SYN and SYN egg packet, then they will try to log this. But since you have sent back the reset, this may avoid being logged into the system. And of course, if the port is indeed closed, then it's back to our normal scenario where you just get the reset acknowledgement packet. Okay, then you can go on doing some other port scanning. That's one scenario, but we can make it a little bit easier. It's called TCP fin scanning. So you can craft the finished flag of the TCP and send a packet to the victim. Okay? And if the port is open, there will be no response from the victim. Because you're not initiating the handshake, the victim just discards the fin packet as receiving it as terminating the connection. If the port is, however, closed, then you will get a reset and acknowledgement packet back. Okay? So this is by design of the TCP, which did not take into account these type of security postures when they were developed about 40 years ago, nearly 50 years ago. Yeah. So, but one thing to note is that some systems, even if the port is open, may still send back the reset packets regardless, and this can be seen as part of the defense technique. Okay, so once you send the fin packet, does not necessarily mean it's closed if you get the reset packet back, but and it just means that maybe we can look into some other techniques that could ensure that this particular port is open, and then you can start discovering some vulnerabilities on it. Okay. And so these are some of the basic techniques that can get you started for scanning some open ports using TCP. And of course, there are other techniques to expand further. Things like the fragmentation scanning, which is chopping the existing scanning packets into smaller fragments. TCP reverse ident scanning, okay, to use the ident protocol to extract connection information. You can use the bounce attack, trying to redirect files, etc. Okay, so there those are listed in the additional items, so you can have a look further. So let's move on to the vulnerability scanning. So the ones that we just talked about can be done at the network layer, trying to look for some open ports, or trying to use the protocol design flaws to identify what kind of open network ports there are using TCP and UDP packets. Vulnerability scanning works at a bit more higher level. So we have a scanning engine. Okay, typically will provide you some UI, and the UI can be used by the user to provide inputs. Those inputs can consist of what kind of host that we want to scan, and the host's details to start the scanning, what kind of vulnerabilities we're interested in, etc. So once those inputs are formulated at step 1, then the scanning engine will start scanning the hosts that have been inputted, and at the same time it will query the vulnerability database to match the information that has been scanned from the hosts. Okay, so step 2 and 3 kind of done concurrently, but typically the scanning engine will refresh its database on a startup from the server, and the scanning can be done to match and calculate to generate the report straight after step 3 locally, and then the scan results can be released back to the user at step 4 to overview what kind of vulnerabilities it has scanned and maybe some metrics associated with those vulnerabilities. Okay, so here's an example, Nessus. Okay, it's been developed by the Tenable company, and it can be run on different operating systems. Okay, so Linux, Unix, Windows, etc. And they keep their own vulnerability database. So there are different types of vulnerabilities, like the National Vulnerability Database, like NVD, etc. But they keep their own vulnerability database as well. So is this a good thing or bad thing? Well, let's start with the good things. What could be a good thing to keep track of your own vulnerability database? Mm. So if you have your own vulnerability database, then it could mean that you can have a certain degree of trust to the values that you keep track of. For example, if you are receiving information from multiple databases from different sources, maybe not all information are correct, or there may be a conflict of the vulnerability information as well. Okay, and also keeping the consistency of the formats, etc., could be difficult because different databases may have different format of keeping the information. Okay, so in that way, you can standardize for your own and ensure that the sources you validate the information of vulnerability prior to putting into your own. Okay, so there are some pros in doing keeping your own vulnerability database, but at the same time, it could be quite bad. So you're probably guessing that you have limited resources to discover and input all the vulnerabilities that are discovered today into your own database. Okay? So there's limitations in resources to locate those informations. Okay? So that can be quite challenging to make sure that your database is up to date. Nevertheless, that's what they're using at the moment, but it is a quite large organization, so they're relatively good at keeping it up to date. They use the Nessus attack scripting language, which means it allows you to write your own scripts and also the plugins. There are various and also many free plugins available to use. But those are the plugins. The product itself is commercial, and this used to be freeware, but they have now released a professional version, and you have a trial version. Currently, last time I checked, is roughly around $3,500 per annum to keep the license to use this. Okay, so it is quite targeting for the enterprise systems. Okay. Because you wouldn't use tools like this for a very small home setup. There are various products available at that scale. Okay. So what does the Nessus provide? Okay. Firstly, it classifies the types of vulnerabilities. For example, Windows vulnerabilities, scripts, remote procedure calls, misconfigurations, insecure implementations, etc. So there are different types of vulnerabilities which the tool will classify them into. And this is very useful because you know what kind of vulnerabilities and what kind of type of vulnerabilities your system has. So you can focus quickly on what type is most vulnerable. So what kind of most vulnerable types that have been discovered, and focus on trying to fixing that first. So you can those information can be used to prioritize how we deal with the vulnerabilities. Okay, and further to that, they also provide the rankings. So vulnerabilities, depending on what kind of impact they cause onto the system, the scores can be assigned to them. Okay, so the Nessus also scores those vulnerabilities based on what they do onto the system. For example, if it's just information gathering type of vulnerability where sniffing can be done on a particular interface, then it may not be as it may not have so much impact compared to a vulnerability which will grant a remote shell to an external attacker. Okay, so those kind of informations are all taken into account, and the scores are assigned based on those. Okay. And the scoring is also further standardized. So there are different vulnerability databases that are available online, and these are actually maintained by large organizations and governments. So the couple of examples are the CVE and also the NVD. Okay, so CVE is a common vulnerability exposure database, which provides a list of standardized names for those vulnerabilities. Okay, so when those vulnerabilities are found and publicly announced, that particular vulnerability will be given a name. And the format is very simple. It starts with CVE dash the year it's found dash the number, and the number is chronological. So if you're the first vulnerability found in that year, you will be given number 1, 0001, and then 0002, etc. Okay, and this is not fixed 4 digits, so it can be up to 5, even etc. Okay, but it starts from 4 digits, and then it grows larger if necessary. The description is also provided as part of the CVE database. So it describes as a textual description of what kind of systems are affected and how it's affected. So for example, 2014 160, there is implementations in the OpenSSL 1.0.1 before the 1.0.1G. They don't handle the heartbeat extension packets. Okay, so this is belonging to the heartbleed bug. So who maintains this? The MITRE Corporation maintains the CVE and moderates the editorial board discussions on how to describe such vulnerabilities and how to link them to relevant informations. Okay, MITRE Corporation works closely with the US government and the Homeland Security Department as well. And there are also various other inputs from public that they take into consideration when posting such details. So NVD is a more the government body kept vulnerability database. So this is maintained by the NIST, which is the US organization. It's similar to the CVE. They share some common grounds. For example, the NVD database will list the vulnerabilities using the CVE names. Okay, and at the same time, it also provides some security metrics about the vulnerabilities. So NVD has what they call a CVSS-based score, common vulnerability scoring system, which has the base score component and also other types of information such as like the attack vectors, exploitability, availability, etc. So there's a bunch of other associated metrics that are described along with the vulnerabilities that are kept within the database. So Looking at the Heartbleed one again, which uses the same CVE name in the MVD database, has the common vulnerability scoring system, the base score of 5. The base score ranges between 1 to 10, where 10 is most significant and 1 is least significant. Okay? So the Heartbleed is known to be roughly about medium type of vulnerability. So if you do have it, it can affect you quite a bit. But there are other vulnerabilities out there that can do some more severe damage. Okay. So in summary of vulnerability scanning, it requires a continuous effort to discover and mitigate such vulnerabilities. Because the vulnerabilities are changing over time due to the changes in attack styles. Okay. And as a result, it is quite difficult to address these problems, especially with new and unknown vulnerabilities come into play, because those tools cannot provide such detection and mitigation for unknown vulnerabilities. Of course, we can use like anomaly-based detections that can try to identify them, but there are limitations, because if it's unknown vulnerability and the attack is very stealth, then there's a good chance that this attack will go unnoticed. Okay? So the global efforts are made to address issues associated with each steps of vulnerability scanning. Okay? So trying to improve the anomaly detection using AI and machine learning. So not just that we can address the known vulnerabilities, but at the same time deal with unknown vulnerabilities. And in general, we're trying to identify misbehaviors in the system that are happening due to attackers exploiting those vulnerabilities. But at the same time, we want to ensure that we can provide and identify those vulnerabilities before they are being exploited, because when those attacks do happen, the exploit sequences can happen very quickly. So that's the summary on vulnerability scanning. So the next item we're looking at is sandboxing. Okay. So I will cover this in the next video.